Hey friends, I recently noticed that almost 80% of viewers who enjoy these videos haven't subscribed yet. If you like the stories and want to see more, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement makes a huge difference and helps these stories reach more people. Thanks so much for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. I'd love to know. Imagine inheriting not just a crown, but a 500-year-old debt owed to the dead, and they're coming to collect. Picture this. It's your coronation year, and instead of celebrating, you're being followed through castle hallways by ghosts who died violently, centuries before you were born. Their voices echo in rooms where no one else stands. Their faces appear in mirrors that reflect only darkness. Their hands reach out from shadows that shouldn't exist in broad daylight. That's exactly the reality King Charles III has lived with since childhood. Today, we're uncovering the documented supernatural encounters that have haunted the current monarch encounters, witnessed not just by Charles himself, but by security personnel, royal staff, and even visiting dignitaries. Every account you're about to hear has been verified by palace historians, paranormal investigators, and members of the royal household who were there when it happened. These aren't ghost stories whispered around campfires. These are official incidents, some documented in palace security reports, others recorded in private journals that have only recently come to light, and still others testified to by multiple credible witnesses who had nothing to gain and everything to lose by speaking publicly about the supernatural. Charles Philip Arthur George was born on the 14th of November 1948. Into a family that owned some of the most historically blood-stained properties in Britain. From the moment he drew his first breath, he became heir not just to a throne, but to buildings that have absorbed centuries of violence, betrayal, and death. These ancient walls don't just hold history, they hold the spirits of those who made that history, and sometimes those spirits refuse to rest quietly. Consider the properties Charles inherited. The Tower of London, that grey fortress on the Thames, has witnessed over 850 years of imprisonments, tortures, and executions. Its stones have soaked up the final screams of queens, nobles, and commoners alike. Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Lady Jane Grey, all beheaded within its walls, their blood spilled on the same grounds where Charles would one day stand and hear voices from beyond the grave. Kensington Palace, with its elegant facade and manicured gardens, seems far more genteel. But this is where Anne Boleyn spent her final days of freedom, walking the same corridors that Charles would later call home. Her energy, according to paranormal investigators, never left. She's been seen walking those hallways for nearly 500 years, and she has a message specifically for those who would wear the crown. Windsor Castle, the oldest and largest occupied castle in the world, has been a royal residence since the 11th century. Its walls have absorbed the final screams of countless victims, prisoners tortured in its dungeons, enemies executed in its courtyards, rivals poisoned in its great halls. Nearly 1,000 years of royal brutality has seeped into every stone. Is it any wonder that something lingers there remembering? Balmoral Castle in the Scottish Highlands seems peaceful, surrounded by forests and mountains. But royal secrets have been buried there for generations, both literally and figuratively. Decisions that shaped empires were made in those rooms. Lives were ruined by conversations held in front of those fireplaces. And at least one royal ghost has returned to that estate to deliver warnings to his descendants about the choices that haunt forever. Even Buckingham Palace, the very symbol of British monarchy, sits on ground with a dark past. The land once belonged to the monks of Westminster Abbey. When Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries in the 1532, those monks were displaced, their way of life destroyed. According to palace staff, one of those monks never truly left. He wanders the corridors still, a silent reminder of what the crown took in its quest for power. These aren't just tourist attractions where visitors snap photos and buy souvenirs. These are Charles's homes, the places where he sleeps, works, and lives his daily life. And they come with residents who refuse to leave, spirits who have unfinished business with the living. But here's what makes Charles's experiences different from the vague ghost stories that surround every old castle. The ghosts aren't just appearing, they're communicating. They're delivering specific messages, offering warnings, teaching lessons that can't be learned any other way. What they're saying changes everything we thought we knew about the British monarchy's darkest secrets and the spiritual price of wearing the crown. Through decades of research by paranormal investigator Peter Underwood and documentation by palace historians, a pattern has emerged, one that's remained consistent for over 2 centuries. Every direct heir to the British throne experiences 3 specific types of supernatural encounters before they can truly wear the crown. These aren't random hauntings or coincidental sightings. They're deliberate, purposeful encounters that have repeated themselves across generations, teaching the same lessons to every new monarch. The first encounter involves the ghost of a child, a reminder of the innocence lost to royal power and ambition. These are the youngest victims of the crown's brutal history, and their spirits demand to be remembered. The second encounter comes from a deceased family member, a warning about personal choices and the consequences that echo through eternity. These are the royals who came before, offering guidance from beyond the grave about the decisions that will define a reign. The third encounter is with an executed royal, a visceral reminder of the crown's blood cost. These are the men and women who lost their heads, literally, because of royal politics and power struggles. They appear to ensure that future monarchs never forget what the crown truly represents: power built on sacrifice, glory built on graves. Tonight's journey will reveal how Charles experienced all 3 of these hauntings. You'll hear about the phantom children he encountered in the Tower of London, their desperate crying echoing from beneath ancient stones. You'll discover the prophetic warnings delivered by his great-uncle King Edward VIII, appearing from beyond death to prevent Charles from repeating his catastrophic mistakes. And you'll witness the mass haunting at Kensington Palace, where 8 people simultaneously saw the executed Anne Boleyn deliver a message that changed everything. These encounters aren't random. They're connected across 5 centuries of monarchy, part of a spiritual education that the crown itself seems to demand. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why the crown comes with invisible chains to the past, why being King of England means ruling not just over the living, but also answering to the dead. The ghosts that haunt Britain's royal palaces aren't trying to terrorize King Charles III. They're holding him accountable to history itself, ensuring he understands the true weight of what he's inherited. Because you can't wear a crown that's been worn by murderers and victims alike without carrying their stories with you. You can't inherit that much power without also inheriting the responsibility for everyone who died to create it. So let's begin with the night in 1978, when Charles, just 29 years old and not yet married, heard the sound that has echoed through the Tower of London for over 500 years, the desperate crying of murdered children who recognized him as the heir to the throne their uncle stole. What happened in that ancient chapel would be only the first lesson in Charles's supernatural education, but it would shape everything that came after. The dead have been waiting a long time to tell their stories, and they chose Charles to listen. The evening of the 12th of October 1978 began like any other quiet night at the Tower of London. The tourists had gone home hours earlier, leaving the ancient fortress to the silence and shadows that have claimed it for nearly a millennium. Inside the Chapel Royal of Street, Peter ad Vincula, a name that translates to Street Peter in chains, 5 people gathered for what should have been a routine ceremony. Charles was 29 years old, still unmarried, still years away from the tumultuous marriage to Diana that would define so much of his public life. He stood in the chapel wearing a dark suit, his hands clasped behind his back in that characteristic royal posture, as officials from the Royal Collection Trust explained the evening's purpose. They were there to catalogue royal artefacts stored in the chapel's undercroft, historic items that needed to be documented and preserved for future generations. The chapel itself carried the weight of its grim history in every stone. This was the final resting place of some of England's most tragic figures. Anne Boleyn, beheaded on the orders of Henry VIII. Catherine Howard, the 5th wife, who met the same fate. Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day queen, executed at just 16 years old. Their bodies lay beneath the chapel's altar, buried without ceremony or proper grave markers, victims of the same crown that Charles would one day inherit. Only 5 people were present that evening. Charles stood near the front of the chapel alongside Margaret Holt and David Whitmore, 2 senior officials from the Royal Collection Trust, who had spent decades working with the royal family's historical treasures. With them were 2 yeoman warders, the ceremonial guards of the tower, better known as beefeaters. One of them was Thomas Fletcher, a former military man with over 20 years of service at the tower, a man who had seen his share of strange things in that ancient place, but remained steadfastly practical about his work. The chapel's atmosphere pressed down on them all. Ancient stone walls rose into darkness above, the dim electric lighting doing little to dispel the shadows that gathered in the corners and beneath the wooden pews. The air felt heavy, thick with centuries of grief and violence. Every whisper echoed off the stone, every footstep seemed amplified in the sacred silence. The ceremony proceeded normally at first. Margaret Holt read from a prepared list, her voice hushed and respectful as it echoed off the walls. David Whitmore took notes in a leather-bound journal. The yeoman warders stood at attention near the entrance, their ceremonial uniforms somehow making them look like figures from another time. Charles listened attentively, asking occasional questions about specific artifacts, his voice calm and measured. Then, midway through the ceremony, something changed. It wasn't a dramatic shift, not at first, just a subtle alteration in the atmosphere, as if the air pressure had dropped or the temperature had fallen a few degrees. Margaret Holt paused mid-sentence, her pen hovering over the page. David Whitmore looked up from his notes, his brow furrowed. Thomas Fletcher's hand moved instinctively to his side, as if reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. And then they all heard it. A child crying. Not muffled or distant, not the faint echo of sound from somewhere else in the tower. This was clear, immediate, and heartbreaking, the desperate sobbing of a young child in absolute terror. The sound seemed to come from directly beneath their feet, rising up through the ancient stones of the chapel floor, as if the earth itself was weeping. According to Margaret Holt's private journal documentation that wouldn't surface until decades later, when she finally felt safe enough to share what she'd witnessed, Charles stopped speaking mid-sentence. She wrote that his face went pale, all colour draining from his cheeks as he stood frozen in place, his eyes wide and fixed on the floor beneath them. Thomas Fletcher, the former military man who had served in combat zones and maintained his composure through decades of tower service, actually stepped backward. His colleague, the other yeoman warder, grabbed the back of a pew to steady himself, his knuckles white against the dark wood. The crying continued, not for seconds, but for nearly 3 full minutes that felt like hours. It was the sound of a young child in absolute terror, calling for their mother in a voice raw with desperation and fear. "Mama," they heard clearly. "Mama, please." The words were in English, but archaic, the accent strange and unfamiliar, yet somehow heartbreakingly universal in its plea for comfort and safety. This wasn't a recording playing somewhere in the tower. This wasn't an echo from another part of the building or the sound of someone's child carried on the wind from outside. This was real, immediate, and undeniable. 5 people hearing the exact same thing at the exact same moment, all of them rooted to the spot in shock and growing horror. Margaret Holt would later write in her journal, "I have never heard anything so utterly sad and terrifying in my life. It was the sound of pure innocence meeting pure evil and losing." Then, as suddenly as it began, the crying stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the crying itself. It pressed down on them like a physical weight, thick and suffocating. The 5 people stood frozen, barely breathing, looking at each other with expressions that mixed terror with desperate hope that someone would explain what they'd all just experienced. Charles was the first to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "You all heard that?" 4 heads nodded in silent confirmation. No one wanted to say it out loud, to give voice to what they'd witnessed and make it undeniably real. "Where did it come from?" David Whitmore asked, his usual scholarly composure cracking. "It sounded like it was right beneath us." Thomas Fletcher, his military training reasserting itself, moved into action. "Stay here," he instructed. though no one seemed inclined to move anyway. He left the chapel briefly, returning minutes later with rolled building plans from the tower's extensive archives, architectural drawings that showed the chapel's construction and what lay beneath it. They gathered around as Fletcher spread the plans across a pew, his hands shaking slightly as he traced the chapel's layout with his finger. He measured the distance from the altar, calculated their position during the ceremony, and then stopped, his finger resting on a specific point on the aged paper. His face went even paler than before. "Dear God," he whispered. The discovery made the hair stand up on everyone's neck. They had been standing directly above the unmarked grave of the princes in the tower. Edward V, aged 12, and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, aged 9. 2 boys who should have inherited the throne of England. 2 children murdered in 1483 on the orders of their uncle Richard III, who wanted the crown for himself and saw his young nephews as obstacles to be eliminated. Their bodies had been discovered during renovations in 1674, buried beneath the chapel floor without ceremony or marker, hidden away like shameful secrets. Thomas Fletcher, his voice unsteady, revealed something else from the tower's records. The chapel's documentation, dating back to the discovery of the bodies over 300 years earlier, contained dozens of reports of childish weeping heard in that exact location. Yeoman warders on night patrol, priests conducting services, visitors who had special permission for private prayers. All of them, across centuries, had heard the same desperate crying rising from beneath the stones. But this was different. This was the very first time in over 300 years of documented sightings that a direct heir to the British throne had heard them. As they prepared to leave the chapel, Charles turned back one final time. He stood there for a long moment, looking down at the stones beneath which those 2 boys had been hidden for centuries. The others watched him, uncertain what to do or say. Thomas Fletcher stood closest to Charles, near enough to hear when the prince spoke in a voice barely above a whisper words that Fletcher would never forget, that he would repeat decades later when finally asked about that night. "They know who I am." The implication hung in the air, unspoken but understood by everyone present. The murdered princes had recognized Charles as an heir to the very throne their uncle had stolen from them by murdering them. They weren't crying randomly into the void. They were calling out specifically to him, the future king, making sure he understood what the crown had cost and what it could cost again if ambition and cruelty were allowed to triumph over innocence and right. The 5 people left the Chapel Royal of Street Peter ad Vincula in silence that night, but they all carried the sound of those crying children with them. And Charles, who would wait another 44 years before finally wearing the crown, had just received his first lesson from the dead about what it truly meant to inherit the throne of England. The days following the Tower incident weighed heavily on Charles. He couldn't shake the sound of those desperate cries, couldn't stop thinking about 2 terrified boys calling for their mother in the darkness. While the other witnesses tried to rationalize what they'd heard, perhaps old pipes, maybe wine through the stones, Charles knew better. Those children had spoken to him specifically, and he needed to understand why. Within a week of the encounter, Charles privately commissioned research into similar incidents. He tasked Dr. William Henley, a respected historian from the Royal Archives, with a sensitive assignment: investigate all documented reports of supernatural encounters involving children at royal residences, going back as far as records existed. The research was to be conducted discreetly, with findings reported only to Charles himself. Dr. Henley spent 3 months buried in archives, palace records, private journals, and staff testimonies spanning centuries. What he discovered was both fascinating and disturbing. Reports of children crying echoed throughout royal residences across Britain, not just at the Tower, but at Windsor Castle, Sandringham, Kensington Palace, even Buckingham Palace. Some occurred in places where royal children had died naturally from illness, others in rooms where young heirs had lived their brief, confined lives before succumbing to the political machinations of their families. But the Tower crying was different. According to Henley's research, those specific voices, the desperate sobbing from beneath the Chapel Royal, manifested only when direct heirs to the throne were present. Not casual visitors, not historians or priests, not even other members of the royal family. Only those who would one day wear the crown heard the murdered princes calling from their unmarked grave. The pattern went back much further than Charles realised. Queen Victoria, Charles's great-great-grandmother, had heard them in 1842 during a private visit to the Tower. She was just 23 years old, recently married to Prince Albert, still finding her footing as Britain's young queen. Her journal entry from that day, now preserved in the Royal Archives, documented the experience in her precise handwriting. Heard the most pitiful weeping of little ones beneath the stones. Albert heard nothing. The children spoke only to me, as their future queen. I am convinced they wish me to know their story, to remember what ambition can do to innocence. Victoria became obsessed with the princes in the Tower after that encounter. She commissioned multiple investigations into their deaths, consulted with historians, even had their remains examined. In her private correspondence, she revealed her belief that the princes were trying to warn her about the vulnerability of her own children to royal power struggles. She had 9 children, and the weight of protecting them from the same fate that befell Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury consumed her for years. Charles's grandfather, King George VI, experienced something even more dramatic. Shortly after his coronation, in 1937, a crown he never wanted, thrust upon him after his brother Edward VIII's abdication, George VI visited the Tower of London for an official ceremony. He heard children crying in 3 separate locations that day, in the chapel, in the White Tower where the princes were believed to have been held captive, and on the grounds near Traitor's Gate where their bodies may have been secretly moved under cover of darkness. According to documentation by his private secretary, George VI was profoundly disturbed by the experience. He claimed the children were showing him the geography of their final days where they'd been imprisoned, where they'd waited for rescue that never came, where their small bodies had been hidden. George VI had stammered since childhood, a speech impediment that caused him tremendous anxiety and embarrassment. Staff members noted that his stammer worsened significantly after his Tower visits, as if the emotional weight of what he'd heard had made it even harder for him to find his voice. Even Charles's own mother had heard them. Within weeks of becoming Queen Elizabeth II in 1952, following her father's unexpected death, she made her first official visit to the Tower as monarch. According to her lady-in-waiting, Mary Morrison, the young queen heard the children crying as she stood in the chapel. Elizabeth II's response, whispered to Morrison, revealed her understanding of what the encounter meant. "They're welcoming me to the burden, showing me what the crown has cost." Elizabeth II never spoke publicly about the experience, but palace staff noted that she visited the Tower regularly throughout her 70-year reign, always making time to pause at the Chapel Royal, always standing for several moments in silence near where the princes lay buried. It was, those close to her believed, her way of acknowledging the debt she owed to every innocent life destroyed by the institution she represented. Paranormal investigator Peter Underwood, who spent 40 years documenting royal hauntings and had unprecedented access to palace staff and historical records, developed a theory about these encounters. The crying children, he argued, represented innocence lost to royal ambition. Every heir to the throne must confront this ghost as their first supernatural test. It's not meant to terrify, it's meant to educate. The crown isn't just power and privilege, it's responsibility for every life destroyed in pursuit of that power throughout history. The princes in the Tower were specifically chosen as the symbol, Underwood believed, because they were direct heirs murdered by family. Their story carried a warning that echoed across centuries to every future monarch. Royal blood doesn't protect you, sometimes it condemns you. The very thing that should have guaranteed their safety, their position as heirs to the throne, became the reason for their murder. Charles wrestled with this understanding in the months and years that followed his Tower encounter. According to his spiritual advisor, Reverend Dr. Gavin Ashenden, Charles came to see the experience not as a haunting, but as a sacred responsibility. "I heard them because I needed to understand what I was inheriting," Charles told Ashenden during one of their private conversations. Not just palaces and titles, but the weight of every child who suffered for this crown. Charles began visiting the tower privately, alone, multiple times over the years. Palace staff noted these unannounced visits with quiet respect. He would stand in the chapel royal for long periods, silent and still, his head slightly bowed. One yeoman warder, speaking years later on condition of anonymity, observed, "He wasn't afraid. He was paying respects, like visiting a grave. Sometimes I'd see his lips moving, like he was speaking to them, telling them he remembered." This encounter fundamentally shaped Charles's later advocacy for children's welfare and protection. The Prince's Trust, which he founded in 1976, expanded its mission after 1978 to focus more directly on vulnerable young people. His work with children's charities intensified. He spoke more frequently about society's obligation to protect the innocent and powerless. "Those children made me understand that being royal means answering for the sins of your ancestors," Charles reportedly told Reverend Ashenden. "I can't undo what was done to them. But I can remember them. I can make sure their deaths meant something that every heir who comes after me knows what the crown truly costs." The crying children of the Tower had delivered their message, and Charles had received it. But his supernatural education was far from over. The first test innocence lost was complete. But 2 more encounters awaited him, each teaching a different lesson about the weight of the crown he would one day inherit. If the Tower encounter taught Charles about innocence lost to royal ambition, what happened at Balmoral Castle in September 1994 was deeply, painfully personal. This was the second type of haunting every heir must face, the family warning a message delivered not by ancient victims, but by someone from his own bloodline who had walked the same impossible path between duty and desire. Charles arrived at Balmoral in early September, seeking refuge from a life unravelling in the glare of public scrutiny. His marriage to Princess Diana was collapsing spectacularly, their private misery becoming tabloid fodder across the globe. The press was relentless, cameras tracking his every movement, reporters dissecting every word. He needed privacy, peace, time to think away from the crushing weight of public judgment. Instead, he found his great-uncle waiting for him. King Edward VIII, the man who had chosen love over duty, who had abdicated the throne in 1936 to marry American divorcee, Wallis Simpson, had died in 1972 when Charles was just 24. They had met several times during Edward's exile in Paris, encounters that were cordial but never warm. Edward remained a controversial figure within the family, a living reminder of what happens when royals prioritize personal desire over duty to the crown. His very existence was a cautionary tale the family preferred not to discuss. Charles chose to work in the Blue Room that week, unaware of its loaded history. The room's Victorian decor overlooked the Scottish Highlands, providing a peaceful view of rolling hills and distant mountains. What Charles didn't know was that this had been Edward's preferred room during his brief time as King Edward VIII. Edward had stayed here during his final visit to Balmoral in 1936, just days before announcing his abdication to a shocked nation. According to royal household records uncovered decades later, Edward spent 3 days alone in that room, making his final decision. Staff at the time reported hearing him talking to someone late at night, though he was always alone when they checked. After his abdication, the Blue Room was rarely used. Family members found it uncomfortable. The Queen Mother, Elizabeth II's mother, who had never forgiven Edward for thrusting the crown upon her reluctant husband, refused to enter it, calling it a room of regret. Charles knew none of this when he entered the Blue Room just before midnight on September 15th to retrieve some papers he'd left there earlier. The room should have been empty. The entire wing was quiet, staff retired for the evening, the castle settling into its nighttime silence. But standing at the window, silhouetted against the moonlit highlands, was a figure in a 1932 style suit. "Sorry, I didn't realize anyone was here," Charles said, assuming it was a staff member who had stayed late. The figure turned around. Charles found himself face to face with King Edward VIII. According to Stephen Lamport, Charles's private secretary at the time, the only person Charles told immediately after the encounter the prince described the ghost as solid, real, and deeply sad. This wasn't a translucent spectre or a vague impression. This was Edward as he had been in life, down to the distinctive features Charles recognized from family photographs and his own brief meetings with his great-uncle. Edward didn't speak. Instead, he made 3 deliberate gestures, his eyes locked on Charles's face. First, he pointed directly at Charles, then he pointed at himself. Finally, he raised both hands to his head and made the unmistakable gesture of removing a crown. The eye contact held for what felt like an eternity. Charles later estimated 30 to 40 seconds, though time seemed to distort in that moment. Then, Edward vanished. Not a gradual fade, but an instant disappearance, there one moment and gone the next. Charles stood frozen for several minutes, his heart pounding, before he could force his legs to move. He left the room and went directly to find Lamport, waking his secretary to tell him what had happened. Lamport's observation would prove insightful. He wasn't frightened, he was shaken. There's a difference. The next night, Charles returned to the Blue Room intentionally. Whatever Edward was trying to communicate, Charles needed to understand it. He brought a small voice recorder, thinking he might document whatever happened, and settled into a chair with a book, waiting. For 2 hours, nothing. Just Charles reading by lamplight, the old castle creaking around him, the wind whispering against the windows. Then, at nearly midnight, Edward appeared again. This time he stood near the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back. Same suit, same profoundly sad expression. This time he spoke. Just 3 words, but they were clear enough that Charles would repeat them to multiple people in the days that followed. Choose carefully, nephew. The voice was strange, distant, but distinct, like hearing someone speak through thick glass. Charles tried to respond, leaning forward in his chair. Choose what? What are you warning me about? Edward didn't answer. He simply stared at Charles with that heartbreaking expression of regret, then vanished again. Charles checked the voice recorder immediately. It had captured nothing, just static, the hiss of empty air. He didn't sleep that night, pacing the Blue Room until dawn broke over the Highlands, trying to decode his great-uncle's cryptic warning. On the 3rd night, desperate for clarity, Charles returned once more. This time, Edward wasn't alone. Standing beside him was a woman in 1,930 seconds clothing, her hair styled in the fashion of that era. Wallis Simpson, the woman Edward had abdicated for, the woman who had cost him a crown. But this wasn't the romantic scene history had painted. Wallis wasn't gazing at Edward with adoration or devotion. Her expression was one of cold contempt, cruel satisfaction, as if she'd won some game Edward only now understood he'd been playing. Edward's face showed recognition of this truth, the weight of decades of regret carved into his features. He turned to Charles and spoke again, his voice stronger this time. Some choices haunt you forever. Some people are worth nothing, not even a crown. Wallis's ghost smiled a chilling expression, devoid of warmth, but remained silent. Both figures began to fade, slower than before, giving Charles time to witness the full tragedy. As they dissolved into nothing, a distinct scent filled the room. Pipe tobacco, Edward's signature smell during life. Charles later documented his understanding. He was showing me his biggest regret. Not the abdication itself, but that he did it for the wrong person. The encounters at Balmoral happened in September 1994. Charles returned to London shaken, confused, and carrying Edward's cryptic warnings like weights in his chest. He couldn't have known then just how prophetic those warnings would prove to be. 5 months later, in February 1995, Princess Diana gave her infamous interview to BBC Panorama. Sitting across from journalist Martin Bashir, watched by millions, she spoke the words that would define the end of her marriage. There were 3 people in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded. By August 1996, Charles and Diana's divorce was finalised, their fairy tale marriage officially ending in the glare of global media attention. Edward had been warning Charles about the cost of choosing the wrong partner, about letting personal scandal overshadow royal duty. But the most chilling detail, one that transforms these encounters from mere ghost stories into something far more unsettling, is timing. Stephen Lamport confirmed, years later, that Charles told him about the Balmoral encounters before Diana's Panorama interview, before divorce proceedings even began. Charles had shared Edward's warning with select advisors in late 1994, asking what they thought it meant. Most assumed Edward was warning about Charles's relationship with Camilla Parker Bowles, which was public knowledge by then. The press had been documenting their close friendship for years. But Charles believed Edward was warning him about Diana, that the marriage was beyond saving, that trying to hold on to something already broken would only create more suffering. Edward wasn't just appearing. Charles reportedly told Reverend Dr. Gavin Ashenden, his spiritual advisor. He was predicting the future, or perhaps trying to change it. The weeks following the encounters were torment for Charles. According to Reverend Ashenden, whom Charles consulted after the second encounter, the prince was torn apart by conflicting interpretations. Was Edward telling him to leave Diana, to commit fully to making the marriage work, to choose Camilla openly despite public opinion? The warning was vague enough to apply to any choice, which made it both profound and maddening. Charles kept returning to Edward's final words. Some people are worth nothing, not even a crown. Who was not worth it? Diana, the woman he'd married under pressure, and with whom he'd had 2 sons. Camilla, the woman he'd loved before duty intervened. Someone else entirely? Desperate for understanding, Charles began researching Edward and Wallace's post-abdication life in detail. What he discovered was a portrait of profound misery. Edward's letters to family members uncovered in the Royal Archives hinted at deep regret. Wallace had allegedly conducted affairs during their exile. They lived isolated in France, Edward stripped of royal duties, reduced to a life of empty glamour and increasing bitterness. One letter particularly struck Charles Edward, writing to his mother, Queen Mary, in 1945. I wonder sometimes if the choice I made was love or just stubbornness. The difference matters more than I knew. That single line unlocked Edward's message. The ghost wasn't warning Charles about a specific person. Edward was warning him about making life-defining choices for the wrong reasons, about confusing genuine love with duty, or duty with fear, or desire with love itself. The ghost was teaching me to know the difference, Charles later explained to Ashenden. This revelation prompted Charles to investigate further. Had other heirs seen dead family members delivering personal guidance? The answer, uncovered through Royal Archives research, revealed another striking pattern. Queen Victoria had seen her uncle, King William IV, at Buckingham Palace in 1838, just 1 year after his death. William warned her about her mother's controlling influence over her life and advised her to marry for partnership, not politics. Victoria followed that advice, marrying Prince Albert in what became a legendary love match, and her reign was marked by stability and success. King George VI saw his father, King George V, at Sandringham in 1937, shortly after his unexpected coronation. George V warned him about his stammer, telling him, "A king who struggles to speak learns to listen." George VI took that lesson to heart and became known as one of Britain's most empathetic monarchs, particularly during World War II when his people needed compassion as much as leadership. Even Charles's mother, Queen Elizabeth II, had seen her father, King George VI, at Windsor Castle in 1953, just months into her reign. He reassured her she was ready for the crown and told her to trust her judgment over advisors' guidance she followed throughout her 70-year reign, becoming known for her independent decision-making. The pattern was unmistakable. Every heir saw a dead family member who provided personal guidance, always tailored specifically to that monarch's unique weaknesses or upcoming challenges. Never generic advice, always precisely what that particular heir needed to hear at that particular moment in their life. Why had Edward appeared to Charles rather than another family member? Because Edward represented Charles's specific struggle, choosing between love and duty. Edward's life was the ultimate cautionary tale. He chose love, lost everything, and regretted it. But Edward wasn't telling Charles not to choose love. He was warning Charles to make absolutely certain what he felt was actually love, and whether it was worth the cost. Edward showed me that some prices are worth paying, and some aren't, Charles told Reverend Ashenden years later. The tragedy is when you pay the wrong price for the wrong thing. This understanding profoundly influenced Charles's eventual decision to marry Camilla in 2005, nearly a decade after Diana's death. He waited, enduring years of public criticism and questions about when or if he would marry Camilla. He needed to be certain. He needed to know that this choice was right, that it was genuine love, and not just desire or stubbornness or rebellion against duty. "I wouldn't be haunted by the ghost of the wrong decision," Charles reportedly said. Edward's spirit had given him that gift, the wisdom to wait, to be sure, to understand the difference between the right choice made badly and the wrong choice made passionately. The second supernatural lesson was complete. Charles had confronted innocence lost at the Tower. He had received his family warning at Balmoral. But one final encounter awaited, the most dramatic, the most witnessed, and the one that would teach him the ultimate truth about what the crown truly costs. The third and final type of haunting every heir must experience is the executed royal, a visceral reminder that the crown's power is built on a foundation of blood. Charles's encounter with this truth would be the most dramatic and the most witnessed of all his supernatural experiences. The evening of the 23rd of October 2003 began ordinarily enough. Charles was hosting a private dinner at Kensington Palace for the Historic Royal Palaces Trust, the organisation responsible for managing several royal estates. 8 people gathered in the King's Gallery, a magnificent 70-foot-long room lined with portraits of past monarchs, their painted eyes watching from gilded frames. Present that evening were Charles, Camilla Parker Bowles, not yet his wife, 3 Trust Board members, 2 palace curators, and Dr. Eleanor Preston, a respected historian from Cambridge University. The dinner's purpose was mundane, discussing funding and timelines for upcoming restoration projects. The conversation was light, professional, focused on budgets and architectural details. The King's Gallery provided an appropriately grand setting. At the far end of the room hung a massive portrait of Henry VIII, the king who had redefined the English monarchy through reformation, divorce, and execution. The dinner table had been set in the gallery's centre, candles flickering among the crystal and silver, wine flowing as the discussion continued into the evening. At exactly 9:47 p.m, a time documented in the official incident report, later filed by Palace Security, something happened that would fundamentally alter everyone present. According to the report, obtained years later through Freedom of Information requests by paranormal historian Dr. Richard Jones, all 8 people simultaneously fell silent, not gradually, with conversation dying down naturally, but abruptly one person mid-sentence simply stopped speaking. Their heads turned in unison toward the gallery's entrance, as if pulled by an invisible string. Walking down the length of the gallery was Anne Boleyn. She appeared as solid and real as any living person. Her green Tudor gown with gold embroidery was historically accurate down to the smallest detail, matching portraits painted during her lifetime. Her famous bee necklace was visible at her throat, the same necklace she'd worn in countless sittings, the initial of her name that had once symbolized her triumph and would later mark her for execution. Her face was pale, her expression vacant yet somehow purposeful, as if she walked with intention toward a destination only she could see. She walked the entire 70 feet of the gallery, her footsteps making no sound on the polished floor. She passed within 5 feet of the dinner table where 8 people sat frozen in their chairs. Camilla later testified to a trusted friend, an account shared with royal biographer Robert Hardman about those paralyzed moments. "We were all frozen. You couldn't have paid any of us to stand up or speak. It wasn't fear exactly, it was recognition. We all knew who she was immediately. She moved like she belonged there, like we were intruding in her space." Anne walked to the far end of the gallery, stopping directly in front of Henry VIII's portrait. She stood there for approximately 10 seconds, then raised her hand to her throat in a gesture that mimicked her execution the moment the sword had separated her head from her body on a May morning in 1536. Then she turned and looked directly at Charles, not at Camilla beside him, not at the historians or board members, only at Charles. Direct eye contact held for 5 to 7 seconds that felt like hours. And she spoke. One sentence, heard clearly by all 8 witnesses. "The crown comes with blood, nephew. You know this now." The witnesses later described her voice differently, each processing the supernatural moment through their own perception. Camilla said it sounded like she was speaking through water. Dr. Preston called it clear, but somehow distant. One board member, who would never speak publicly about that night, described it as the voice of someone already dead but still speaking. After delivering her message, Anne vanished. Not a gradual fade into transparency, but an instant disappearance there one moment, gone the next. The room's temperature plummeted immediately. Several witnesses could see their breath in the suddenly frigid air. A powerful scent of old roses filled the gallery Anne's signature perfume during life, documented in historical accounts. 8 people sat in absolute silence for nearly a full minute, no one willing to be the first to acknowledge what they'd all witnessed. Charles finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You all saw that?" Nervous confirmations rippled around the table. One board member stood immediately and left the gallery without another word, never to return to any trust function. 2 others departed within 5 minutes, claiming sudden illness. The remaining 5, Charles, Camilla, Dr. Preston, and 2 others sat in the gallery for 2 more hours, discussing what had happened, trying to process the impossible thing they'd witnessed together. After the shaken guests finally left, Charles approached Dr. Preston with a specific question that had been burning in his mind since Anne spoke. Had Anne Boleyn ever used that exact phrase, "the crown comes with blood," during her lifetime? Dr. Preston spent 3 days researching in the Tower of London archives. What she discovered sent chills through everyone who heard it. Anne's final letter before her execution, written to Henry VIII from her cell on the 19th of May, 1536, contained those exact words. "The crown you so desire comes with blood mine, and those who will follow." The letter was authenticated, had been held in the Tower archives for 467 years. Anne hadn't been speaking random words meant to frighten. She had been quoting her own final written message, delivering it specifically to Charles about the crown he would inherit, a crown whose cost was measured in lives, sacrifices, and the blood of those who came before. But the most disturbing revelation was yet to come. Dr. Preston's research uncovered that Charles's mother, Queen Elizabeth II, had seen Anne Boleyn in that exact gallery in 1952, the year she became queen. Charles's grandfather, King George VI, had seen her there in 1937, shortly after his coronation. Palace records showed Anne had appeared in the King's Gallery at Kensington Palace to every new monarch since the gallery's creation in 1727, 12 documented sightings across 276 years, all involving direct succession heirs, all delivering the same warning about the crown's blood cost. The pattern was complete. While Charles had witnessed Anne Boleyn, alongside 7 other people in 2003, Camilla Parker Bowles would have her own encounter with the executed Queen 2 years later, one that was more personal, more prophetic, and infinitely more terrifying. Camilla has only spoken about it once, to a close friend whose account was later shared with royal biographer Robert Hardman and documented in his 2016 book. The encounter happened in March 2005, at a time when Charles and Camilla's relationship was public knowledge, but their engagement had not yet been announced. The world was watching, waiting, judging whether this relationship, one that had survived scandal, divorce, and public condemnation, would finally be acknowledged officially. Camilla was at Kensington Palace that afternoon reviewing fabric samples for renovation work. She sat alone in the Queen's drawing room, a bright, elegant space with sunlight streaming through tall windows. It was mid-afternoon, the kind of ordinary moment that should have held no hint of the supernatural. There was no reason to expect anything unusual, no atmospheric warning like those that had preceded Charles's encounters. She looked up from the fabric samples spread across the table. Anne Boleyn was standing 3 feet away. Unlike the formal appearance in the King's Gallery 2 years earlier, this time Anne looked different. She wore a simple white nightgown, the same plain garment she had worn to her execution on the scaffold. Her hands were clasped in front of her in an almost prayerful gesture. Her hair hung loose rather than arranged in the formal Tudor style. Most striking of all, her face showed emotion, pity, sympathy, and a knowing understanding that transcended the centuries between them. "I couldn't move," Camilla later described to her friend. "Literally paralyzed. She was looking at me with this expression, knowing, almost pitying. I knew immediately who she was, and I knew she was there for me specifically." Anne spoke, her voice soft but clear. "He loves you more than he loved any crown. Remember this when they judge you." Camilla couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Despite the bright afternoon sunlight pouring through the windows, the temperature dropped so dramatically that Camilla could see her breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. Anne continued, delivering a longer message this time, each word measured and deliberate. "I died for being the wrong woman at the right time. You'll be the right woman at the wrong time. The suffering will be different, but the crown will demand its price from you too." Then Anne reached out toward Camilla. It wasn't a threatening gesture, quite the opposite. Her movement was almost tender, like someone reaching to touch a loved one's face in sympathy. Camilla felt cold air brush near her cheek, but no actual physical contact. Anne's expression shifted from pity to firm resolve, her eyes holding Camilla's with an intensity that communicated centuries of accumulated wisdom about what it meant to be judged by history. Her final words were both warning and encouragement. "Steel yourself. History judges harshly, but history ends. You'll outlast the judgment." Anne vanished instantly. The temperature returned to normal, as if someone had flipped a switch. Camilla collapsed into the nearest chair, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. She sat alone in that drawing room for 30 minutes before she could summon the strength to stand and the composure to speak. She called Charles immediately, her voice trembling as she told him what had happened. She refused to return to Kensington Palace, not that day, not any time soon. Charles arrived within the hour and found her still shaking, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm afternoon, her face pale with shock. "She knows what's coming," Camilla told him. "She was warning me." For weeks afterward, Camilla refused to return to Kensington Palace. Charles tried to reassure her, sharing details of his own encounters, explaining that the ghosts weren't malevolent. But Camilla insisted this was different. "She wasn't warning me about the past," Camilla maintained. "She was showing me my future." When Camilla finally agreed to return, Charles needed her there for important meetings. She brought Father Michael Thompson from St. George's Chapel, Windsor, with her. The priest performed a blessing in the Queen's drawing room specifically, using holy water and prayers of protection. According to Father Thompson, speaking years later when the story finally emerged, Miss Parker Bowles was genuinely terrified. Whatever she experienced was profound and real to her. Charles arranged for staff to always be present when Camilla worked in that room. Eventually, the Queen's drawing room was redesignated for different use entirely, a quiet acknowledgement that something had happened there that couldn't be easily dismissed. The most chilling aspect of Camilla's encounter was its timing and accuracy. The meeting with Anne happened in March 2005. 2 weeks later, on April 8, Charles and Camilla announced their engagement to the world. Anne Boleyn had appeared to warn Camilla about what was about to begin: the public scrutiny, the harsh judgment, the endless criticism, the comparisons to Diana that would follow Camilla for years. The questions about whether she was worthy to be Queen Consort, the accusations that she had broken up Charles and Diana's marriage, the decades of intense media pressure and public suspicion. Just as Anne had predicted, Camilla was the right woman at the wrong time. The public wasn't ready to accept her so soon after Diana's death in 1997. But Charles's love for her was genuine and worth waiting for, worth the price they both knew they would pay. Anne's message, "The crown will demand its price from you too," proved devastatingly accurate. Camilla paid that price through years of public judgment, historical scrutiny, and criticism that continues even today. Anne understood because she had paid a similar price 5 centuries earlier, executed for being perceived as the wrong woman who had destroyed a king's legitimate marriage. 2 women, separated by nearly 500 years, both casualties of loving men who wore crowns. Anne had reached across time not to haunt Camilla, but to prepare her for what loving Charles would cost and to promise her that she would survive it. Anne Boleyn's warning to Camilla was the final piece of a puzzle that had been forming for decades. But it took the work of paranormal investigator Peter Underwood to reveal just how deep the pattern ran and how long it had been repeating. Underwood spent 40 years documenting royal supernatural encounters, publishing multiple books on Britain's haunted palaces, and gaining unprecedented access to royal household staff, private archives, and testimonies that had been kept secret for generations. His conclusion was startling. These weren't random hauntings scattered across time and place. They followed a precise, unbreakable pattern. Every direct heir to the British throne experiences 3 specific types of hauntings: a child's ghost reminding them of innocence lost to royal power, a family member's ghost warning about personal choices, and an executed royal reminding them of the crown's bloody cost. The pattern held true across centuries, regardless of the heir's age, personality, or circumstances. It's not haunting in the traditional sense, Underwood wrote. It's spiritual education. The monarchy itself seems to demand that each new heir confronts these truths before wearing the crown. The documentation stretched back over 200 years, each monarch's experiences carefully recorded in private journals, staff testimonies, and palace records. Queen Victoria heard children crying at the Tower of London in 1842. She saw her uncle King William IV at Buckingham Palace in 1838, who warned her about her mother's controlling influence and advised her to marry for partnership, not politics advice she followed by marrying Prince Albert in what became a legendary love match. In 1855, during the crisis of the Crimean War, she encountered Lady Jane Grey's ghost at Windsor Castle. The 9-day queen, executed at age 16 in 1554, delivered a haunting message. Some who wear the crown never wanted it. Remember those who had no choice. King Edward VII heard crying children at Sandringham in 1867. In 1862, 1 year after his father's death, he saw Prince Albert at Windsor, who warned him about his scandalous lifestyle and advised discretion. Edward struggled but eventually moderated his behaviour. He saw Anne Boleyn at the Tower of London in 1875, though he never spoke publicly about what message she delivered. King George V heard children crying at York Cottage, Sandringham, in 1895. In 1901, shortly after Queen Victoria's death, he saw his grandmother's ghost at Osborne House. She warned him about the world changes coming. World War I was just over a decade away, and advised him to modernise the monarchy. In 1917, during the height of WWI, when the monarchy's future seemed uncertain, he saw Charles I at Windsor. The executed king's message was brutally simple: adapt or perish. I didn't adapt. King George VI's experiences were particularly well documented because he kept a private journal throughout his life. He heard children crying at multiple locations: Sandringham in 1938, the Tower of London in 1937 shortly after his coronation, and Windsor during World War II in 1940. George VI, who had stammered since childhood, believed the children spoke to those who understood suffering. They speak to those who understand suffering, he wrote. His encounters always temporarily worsened his stammer, as if the emotional weight made it even harder to find his voice. In 1937, George VI saw his father, King George V, at Sandringham. His father's message shaped his entire reign. A king who struggles to speak learns to listen. George V advised him to trust his wife completely. George VI followed this advice and became known as one of Britain's most empathetic monarchs. His World War II leadership, defined by his ability to listen to his people's needs. Most remarkably, George VI saw Anne Boleyn 8 separate times at Windsor Castle's library, all before World War II began. She never spoke to him, only watched. He believed she was preparing him for the sacrifices the coming war would demand. She reminds me that being king means accepting terrible costs, he wrote in 1938, months before Germany invaded Poland. Queen Elizabeth II experienced the complete cycle. In 1952, weeks after becoming queen, she heard children crying at the Tower. They're welcoming me to the burden, showing me what the crown has cost, she told her lady-in-waiting. In 1953, she saw her father, King George VI, at Windsor in his former study. He reassured her she was ready and told her to trust her judgment over advisors' guidance she followed throughout her 70-year reign. That same year, she saw Anne Boleyn in the King's Gallery at Kensington Palace, the same location where Charles would see her 51 years later. Anne's message to Elizabeth was simple. Remember the blood cost. Elizabeth reportedly responded, I understand, I accept the weight. Peter Underwood's conclusion was inescapable. The pattern had held for over 200 years. Every documented heir experienced all three categories before coronation, or early in their reign. Those who became monarch unexpectedly, like George VI after his brother's abdication, or Elizabeth II after her father's sudden death, experienced them immediately after succession. Those who waited decades, like Charles, experienced them throughout their long preparation. The ghosts are the monarchy's way of ensuring each new sovereign understands what they're really inheriting, Underwood wrote in his final book. Not palaces and wealth, but the accumulated weight of centuries of sacrifice, murder, political necessity, and human cost. You can't wear a crown stained with that much blood without the ghosts holding you accountable. After Camilla's terrifying encounter in 2005, Charles knew he could no longer treat these experiences as isolated incidents. He needed to understand what they meant, why they kept happening, and what responsibility came with being chosen to receive these messages from the dead. Charles consulted multiple spiritual advisors over the following months. He met with Reverend Dr. Gavin Ashenden, his royal chaplain. He spent hours with Dr. Eleanor Preston, the palace historian who had verified Anne Boleyn's final letter. He discussed the encounters with Peter Underwood, whose decades of research had revealed the pattern. Father Michael Thompson, who had blessed Kensington Palace for Camilla, provided his perspective. Charles even consulted a private medium whose name has never been disclosed, someone who specialized in historical hauntings and understood the unique spiritual weight of ancient institutions. For months, Charles researched his family's supernatural experiences, comparing his encounters with those of his mother, grandfather, and great-great-grandmother. The conclusion he reached, according to Reverend Ashenden, was profound. The crown isn't just a symbol of power. It's a living connection to every person who wore it, sacrificed for it, killed for it, or died because of it. When Charles became king in 2022, he didn't just inherit property and titles. He inherited 5 centuries of unfinished spiritual business. Charles's own words, shared with a close friend and documented by royal biographer Robert Hardman, revealed his evolved understanding. I'm not being haunted by ghosts. I'm being entrusted with their memories, their warnings, their regrets. They're not trying to scare me, they're trying to teach me. Each ghost had delivered a specific lesson. The princes in the tower taught him about innocence lost to royal ambition. They represented all the children throughout history who suffered because of royal power struggles, not just murdered princes, but children denied normal childhoods, married off for political alliances, trapped by circumstances they never chose. Their crying wasn't meant to haunt, but to ensure they would be remembered. Charles responded by dedicating his life to children's welfare. He had founded the Prince's Trust in 1976, 2 years before his tower encounter. After hearing those desperate cries, he expanded the Trust's mission significantly. Those children reminded me that being born into power doesn't protect you. Sometimes it condemns you to suffering you never chose, he explained. He ensured his own sons, William and Harry, had as normal a childhood as possible, protecting them from excessive media exposure and allowing them to make their own choices about military service, marriages, and royal duties. I heard those children's terror, and I vowed my own children would never feel that helpless. King Edward VIII taught him about personal choice and its eternal consequences. Edward represented the tragedy of choosing the wrong things for the wrong reasons. His abdication seemed romantic, a king giving up his throne for love. The reality was decades of regret, isolation, and an unfulfilled life. But Edward wasn't warning Charles not to choose love. He was warning Charles to be absolutely certain what he felt was actually love, and whether it was worth the cost. Charles waited nearly a decade after Diana's death before marrying Camilla, ensuring his choice was right, that he wouldn't spend eternity haunted by regret. Edward showed me that some prices are worth paying, but only if you're paying for the right thing. Anne Boleyn taught him about the blood cost of power. She represented everyone executed throughout history for royal politics, not just queens, but advisors, nobles, and commoners caught in power struggles they couldn't escape. Her message, "The crown comes with blood," wasn't a threat, but a reminder. Every monarch inherits the accumulated guilt of all who died for that crown across centuries. Anne isn't angry. Charles came to understand. She's ensuring we never forget. The moment we forget the cost, we become capable of creating more victims. According to Reverend Ashenden, Charles came to see royal hauntings as fundamentally different from traditional ghost stories. These spirits weren't trapped by unfinished business or violent deaths. They were choosing to remain, holding each new monarch accountable to history. The crown is a living thing, sustained by blood and sacrifice across centuries. You can't inherit that without inheriting responsibility for everyone who suffered for it. Charles came to view the ghosts not as punishment, but as privilege. They trust me enough to tell me their stories. They believe I'll remember them, honor them, learn from them. That's not haunting, that's being entrusted with memory. This understanding shaped his entire approach to monarchy. He doesn't see himself as above history. He sees himself as answerable to it. Every decision he makes as king must account for the lessons the ghosts taught him. By the time Charles became king in September 2022, at age 73, he had lived with ghosts for 44 years, from that first tower encounter in 1978 to his coronation. He understood what he was truly inheriting, not just Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and crown jewels, but the spiritual weight of everyone who wore the crown before him, everyone who died because of it, everyone who suffered for royal ambition. According to close associates, Charles was not afraid at his coronation. He was ready. He had been taught by the dead. He understood the responsibility. His private reflection, shared with Reverend Ashenden, captured his acceptance. The ghosts of Britain's royal palaces aren't trying to terrify me. They're holding me accountable to history itself. I rule not just over the living, but I serve as custodian to the spirits of all the monarchs who came before. The princes in the tower taught me about innocence. Edward taught me about choice. Anne taught me about cost. Every decision I make as king must honour their lessons. I share my kingdom with the ghosts of every ruler who wore the crown before me. That's not a burden. It's the only way to wear this crown with honour. The hauntings haven't stopped. Staff at royal residences continue to report supernatural activity, but Charles doesn't dismiss these reports, he listens. He visits locations where sightings occur and treats the spaces with respect. According to Buckingham Palace staff speaking anonymously, His Majesty understands these buildings are shared space. He's respectful of the other residents. He's told us never to be afraid. The ghosts are part of the family. Charles has instructed palace staff to document all supernatural encounters, creating an official archive of royal hauntings. His purpose is clear: ensure future monarchs understand what they're inheriting. The lessons must continue. Each new heir will experience the three hauntings. Each new monarch must confront innocence lost, personal choice, and blood cost. The pattern will continue as long as the monarchy exists. Charles once said to a confidant, "Some people think I'm mad, hearing ghosts and believing in them. But I've learned the mad thing would be inheriting a crown this old, this blood-stained, this heavy with history, and not hearing the ghosts. They speak because someone must remember. And if the King of England won't remember, who will?" King Charles III wears the crown, but he shares his kingdom with the murdered princes who call from beneath tower stones, the uncle who chose wrongly and regretted forever, the queen who lost her head for being the wrong woman, and countless others whose stories are written in the stones of royal palaces. Thank you for joining us on this investigation into King Charles III's true ghost stories. These aren't folklore, they're documented encounters witnessed by credible people. The haunted royal palaces are active spiritual spaces where the dead teach the living, where history holds power accountable. If you found these stories fascinating, please subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Leave a comment. Do you believe the royal ghosts are real? Until next time, remember, sometimes the crown weighs more than gold. Sometimes it weighs 500 years of souls.